Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, there was a handout. Everybody, I assume, has gotten the handout. Okay, last week I put on the board a kind of table which shows the way the teachings on the development of insight in the early Buddha suttas can be understood as involving what we call the intersection of two basic lists, or two basic sets of components. One are what I call the substance or the material component, and this is the groups of factors, the groups of categories into which the Buddha has organized the constituents of a living being, a sentient being. And so we have the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, then 4 elements, sometimes there are 6 elements, 18 elements mentioned. Then we have the different types of feelings, and then there's a classification in terms of faculties, the sense faculties, or different types of feelings which are considered as faculties. So one aspect for the development of insight is the material that one is working with, these categories of phenomena. The second aspect is what we might call the formal aspect, the patterns in terms of which one is to contemplate these phenomena. So the patterns function somewhat as a way of organizing these phenomena. Or we could say they give us a perspective from which to view these phenomena. And looking through the Nikayas, one finds various forms or patterns, but I selected some of the most prominent ones, 4 of the most prominent ones. One is what I call the 4 truth pattern. This is the pattern of the 4 noble truths. And so here, in the 4 noble truths, one takes suffering as the subject, and then one proceeds from suffering to its cause or origin, then to its cessation, then to the way leading to its cessation. But we can apply that same pattern to almost any phenomena. And so we can apply it to the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases. We don't find it explicitly related to the 4 elements, but we could do so. And so the feelings, faculties, they could all be viewed by way of the 4 truths. What is the factor? What is its origin? What is cessation? And what is the way leading to its cessation? The second pattern is in terms of the 3 characteristics: impermanent, suffering, non-self, anicca, dukkha, anatta. So these can be taken, each one of these can be taken individually and used as a point of view for examining the phenomena. But the most typical way we find in the suttas is putting all 3 together, forming a sequence from what is impermanent, that is dukkha or bound up with suffering, and what is impermanent, bound up with suffering, cannot be taken as oneself, so it's non-self. Okay, a third pattern is the pattern, what I call the gratification triad. That is 3 terms which begin with gratification. So gratification, the danger or the unsatisfactoriness, and then the third is the escape or release. Okay, and then the fourth pattern preserves the gratification triad, but it precedes it with 2 other factors to make a fivefold pattern. There's the origin and passing away, and then gratification, danger, and escape. Okay, so in the table that I handed out, I filled in at least some of the most important suttas which illustrate those patterns with regard to each of the 5 types of subjects. And all of these suttas are taken from the Samyutta Nikaya, in which these patterns are most prominent. We also find them in the other Nikayas, at least Majjhima Nikaya and Anguttara Nikaya, but at least having some examples all from one Nikaya is useful. Okay, so last week we went through a sutta we started the section on the 5 aggregates, starting on page 335 of the book. And I went through a sutta called Phases of the Aggregates. And this sutta treats the 5 aggregates in terms of the 4 truth patterns. So we saw how the sutta takes each of the 5 aggregates, for example, beginning with material form, then it defines what is material form, gives a definition, then it explains the origin or the arising of form, its cessation, and then the Noble Eightfold Path as the way to its cessation. Okay, so now we're going to continue further, and we come to a sutta which occurs both in the Majjhima Nikaya and in the Samyutta Nikaya, which deals with, I call this a catechism or a question and answer session on the 5 aggregates. And so here we'll find various approaches taken to understand the 5 aggregates. Okay, so the sutta begins one time when the Buddha was dwelling in Savatthi, and then one monk, he's sitting together with the monks on the full moon night, and then one monk gets up from the assembly and he requests permission from the Buddha to ask them questions about a particular point. Okay, so the Buddha gives him permission, then the monk asks, well, he actually knows the subject, but he just wants to get confirmation. He says, aren't these the 5 aggregates subject to clinging? That is, the form aggregate subject to clinging, the feeling aggregate subject to clinging, the perception aggregate, the volitional formations aggregate, and the consciousness aggregate subject to clinging. Okay, so this confirms simply what are the 5 aggregates. Then the monk asks, in what are these 5 aggregates subject to clinging rooted? Then the Buddha says these 5 aggregates subject to clinging are rooted in desire. The word here is chanda. The word chanda is what we usually translate as desire, and sometimes the word chanda can have a positive meaning. It can signify a wholesome quality. When it's used in this sense, chanda is one of the factors of striving. For example, when the Buddha speaks about right effort, he says, how does one generate, or how does one apply right effort? Here, one generates desire. One arouses a desire for removing unwholesome qualities and for developing wholesome qualities. Okay, so the word chanda, desire, is sometimes used in a good, approving sense. One of the factors in the path. But the word chanda is also used in a negative sense. A sense in which it is equivalent to tanha, or craving. And so when we have this statement that the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are rooted in desire, here, what kind of desire is intended? What kind of desire is this? Yeah, the negative sense. It's the equivalent to craving. And so one could say that these 5 aggregates are rooted in desire. The text doesn't give a further elaboration of this, but the way I would understand it, based on the commentaries, that these 5 aggregates come into being because of the craving from our previous existence. That this craving is, you say, the force or the seed which brings the 5 aggregates into being. Craving is what drives the process of existence forward from life to life. And so as long as there is craving, then when death takes place, it will be followed by a new arising, by the arising of a new existence. And what does that existence consist in? It consists in some combination of the 5 aggregates. And then as long as life continues, as long as there is craving present within the stream of the mind, whether dormant or active, then when death takes place at the end of this existence, that craving becomes the force that brings into being still another existence. And that new existence again will be a combination of the 5 aggregates. Okay, so next the monk asks a very subtle question, an important question and a subtle question. Now we speak about the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. I'll write the full expression on the board in Pali. Yeah, so the translation as 5 aggregates subject to clinging is something of, let's call this an interpretive translation. But if we take the actual Pali expression, it's pancha, which means 5, upadana means clinging, and kanda means aggregate. So literally it's simply 5 clinging aggregates. And so this monk was probably puzzled by this expression, panchupadana kanda. And so he wanted to know whether clinging is the same as these 5 aggregates. So does panchupadana kanda mean 5 aggregates which are forms of clinging? In other words, is bodily form, physical form, is that a type of clinging? Is feeling a type of clinging? Is perception a type of clinging? Are the volitions a type of clinging? Is consciousness a type of clinging? So that all the 5 aggregates together are just 5 types of clinging. Is that the meaning he's asking? Or is the clinging something apart from the 5 aggregates? Something separate from the 5 aggregates? So we have the 5 aggregates as one thing, and then the clinging upadana is something separate from them that clings to them. But the Buddha rejects both of these alternatives. He says that clinging is neither the same as the five aggregates, subject to clinging, nor is the clinging something apart from the five aggregates, subject to clinging. But rather, the desire and lust for them, that is the clinging there. Actually, that statement, maybe it doesn't seem to be perfectly clear, so I'll explain the intention. We take the five aggregates, and then we take each one individually. Is material form clinging? No. Material form is just matter, or the body. Is feeling clinging? The feeling is just the way of experiencing the object, whether pleasant, painful, or neutral. Is perception clinging? The perception is simply our way of registering the objects. Sometimes the distortions come in perception, but the perception itself is not clinging. But now when we come to the fourth aggregate, the aggregate of volitional formations, which is chaitana, volition, this is where we find clinging. So clinging, of the five aggregates, clinging is a component of the aggregate of volitional formations. Clinging is a way of responding or reacting to our experience. So it's that aspect of volitional activity through which we grasp and cling to things, refusing to let go or resisting the act of letting go, trying to hold and preserve things with the idea that this is mine, this is I, this is what I want. And then consciousness is just the awareness that arises based on any of the sense bases. So the consciousness is not the clinging. So of the five aggregates, clinging is found in one of the aggregates. It's found in the aggregate of volitional formations. But the clinging that occurs in the aggregate of volitional formations grasps upon all of the five aggregates. So because of this clinging, one grasps. The clinging is desire and lust. Desire for what one doesn't have, chandaraga. A desire for what one doesn't have, and then attachment to what one does have. And so this is the clinging. One clings to material form, thinking this is mine, this is what I am. One clings to feeling, one clings to perception, one clings to one's volitions, and one clings to consciousness. So we have, this is the material or substance of clinging. The objects of clinging are the five aggregates, but within those five aggregates, within one of those five aggregates, the aggregate of volitional formations, we find the clinging that holds to them. So the Buddha says, the desire and lust for them, that is the clinging there. Okay, then this monk asks, can there be diversity in the desire and lust for these five aggregates subject to clinging? Okay, so now the Buddha is going to show how this clinging works. So the Buddha says there can be, and how is this so? Here it occurs to someone, may I be of such form in the future. In other words, may I have such a body, such features, such a figure, and so on, in the future. May I be of such feelings, or may I experience such feelings in the future. May I have such perceptions in the future. May I have such volitional formations in the future. May I have such consciousness in the future. So in other words, the clinging in this particular passage, it's directed to the future. It seems to me actually that clinging can arise in regard either to past, present, or the future. But I think it's better to hold the questions till I ask for questions. Otherwise, if each time you come up, then it sort of interferes with the continuity. Okay. Okay, so there can be clinging directed to all three periods of time. At least this is my understanding. So certainly we have clinging directed to the past, don't we? We have memories, we hold on to these memories, kind of nostalgia. And then we want to always go back to these memories. Like the other day, or actually it was a couple of weeks ago, I found something interesting with Google Map that one could enter an address and then it will take you to pictures of the place where you direct the address. And so out of curiosity I put in the address of the house where I grew up in my childhood. And the house is still there. It looks very much the same the way it did in those days. Then you can move the cursor through the streets. So I took I had thought to myself, I bet in those days the cross streets nearby used to have these little shops, one shop after another, and I had thought to myself, I bet that all of those shops have been knocked down and has been replaced by a Walmart or a Stop and Shop or giant shopping mall. But I took a walk on the computer down that street, and to my surprise and pleasure, the little shops are still there. There's like not one of these, is it CVS? Or these big pharmacies, but it's still a little local pharmacy shop on the corner, and a vegetable and fruit shop still there. It's not all been replaced by a big supermarket. And even there's a shoe shop there. I'm sure that it's probably the son or grandson of the shoemaker that was there when I was a boy. And they say shoes repaired. I've been thinking when I replace my shoes, there are probably no more shoe repair shops anymore. Because now you go to the shoe shop, you buy the pair of shoes, and you use the shoes for a couple of years, and when they get worn out, you just throw them away and buy a new pair of shoes. But here's a shoe repair shop still there. This is Brooklyn, New York. Okay, anyway, this is just an illustration how the mind clings to the past. Okay, so then, anyway, we all have plenty of memories that we cling to, and then we let the mind wander back into the past, sort of nostalgizing over these memories. Then we cling to the present. This is my beautiful Chinese cup with characters, 4 characters on it. It's actually not really mine, but maybe I'll take this back down to my room. I don't have a nice cup like this in my room. Okay, then we have clinging to the future. Okay, I want to have maybe to go on being beautiful and healthy for another 20, 30 years. Or then I think, well, I can't be beautiful in this life, but in my next life I will be a very handsome movie star or sports star. Well, let me not come back to this human world. I will become a handsome deva, deity. And then similar with regard to feelings, perceptions, volitions, consciousness. We have this desire always projecting towards the future. And so this is how there is diversity in the desire and lust, or desire and attachment for the five aggregates. Okay, so now the monk asks the question, in what way does the designation aggregates, here he uses the Pali word khanda, apply to the aggregates? This word khanda is used in the Pali text in various senses. Sometimes it's used to refer to the trunk of a tree is called a khanda. Sometimes it's used for a mass or a pile of things. It's called a khanda. And so the word khanda has the sense, or suggests the meaning of that which is massive, or that which collects together a number of items. And so that is the sense in which the word is being used here. It's a heap or a collection of things. And so how should this be understood? The Buddha explains, whatever kind of form there is, whether past, future, or present. Okay, this is by way of the three periods of time. Internal, that's referring to oneself, or external, referring to the outer world or to other beings. Gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all of these brought together are called the form aggregate. Similarly, with regard to feelings, whatever feeling there is, past, future, or present, whatever perception there is, past, future, or present, and so on. Whatever feeling there is, whatever perception there is, whatever volitional formations there are, past, future, or present, whatever kind of consciousness there is, past, future, or present, internal or external, or so on, this is called the consciousness aggregate. Okay, so it's in this way that the designation aggregates applies to the aggregates. That is, we take all the instances, all the examples, all the different manifestations of whatever has the characteristic of form. And we put that all together and we call it, this is the form aggregate. Then we take every type of feeling throughout all periods of time, feelings of every type, every degree, every quality, bring them together under the heading of feelings. And so with perception, so with volitions, so with consciousness. Okay, then the monk asks still another question. He says, what is the cause, what is the condition for the manifestation of the form aggregate? And then what is the cause, what is the condition for the manifestation of the other aggregates? Okay, we went through this last time in regard to the origin of each of the five aggregates. But here there's a little difference in the Buddha's answer in regard to the form aggregate. Okay, here the Buddha says, the four great elements are the cause and condition for the manifestation of the form aggregate. Last week, when we were going through the earlier sutta, this is on page 336, the top of page 336, the question is raised, what is form? Form is the four great elements, and the form derived from the four great elements. Then with the arising of nutriment, there is the arising of form. With the cessation of nutriment, there is the cessation of form. And the way I understood that, the way I explained it last week, I understand that passage to be referring specifically to the form or the matter of the physical body, because the physical body depends upon nutriment. If we don't take any food, then the body starts to lose its mass until one becomes famished, and then if one doesn't get any further nutriment, then one will die and the body will disintegrate. But here the answer is given that the four great elements are the cause and condition for the manifestation of the form aggregate. But what is the form aggregate? It's the four great elements and the matter derived from the four great elements. So this is a little bit puzzling. How could the four great elements be a cause and condition for form when form consists of the four great elements? So the way I would understand it, or I would understand it in this way, we have these four great elements, and these four great elements relate to one another as enabling conditions or necessary conditions, that in order for three of the great elements to exist, the fourth element must exist. So if we ask, how is it possible for the water element, the fire element, and the air element to exist? They depend on the earth element. How is it possible for the water element to exist? How is it possible for the earth element, the fire element, and the air element to exist? They depend on the water element. How is it possible for the fire element to exist? It depends... No, that doesn't do it. Okay, let's do it this way. How is it possible for the earth element to exist? The earth element depends on the water element, the fire element, and the air element. How is it possible for the water element to exist? The water element depends on the earth element, fire element, and air element. The fire element, in turn, depends on the earth, water, and air elements, and the air element depends on the earth, water, and fire elements. So all four elements are, in the Abhidhamma, this is called Anyamanya Paccaya, which means mutuality conditions or reciprocal conditions. Each is a condition for the others. It's like four legs of the chair. When the chair stands, because it has the four legs supporting it. If we remove one leg of the chair will topple over. Okay, and then all of the derivative material form, the form derived from the four elements, that all depends upon the four great elements. So the form of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, visible form, sound, smell, taste, texture, all of those depend upon the four great elements. Okay, then what is the cause and condition for the manifestation of the feeling aggregate? The cause and condition is contact. What is contact? Contact is coming together of consciousness with an object through the sense faculty. And so when contact takes place, feeling arises based on that contact. So feeling is based on the contact, how one experiences the object, whether pleasantly, painfully, or with neither pleasure nor pain. Then contact is the cause and condition also for the perception aggregate. It's when contact with the object occurs that one perceives it. Contact is the cause and condition for the manifestation of the volitional formations aggregate. It's when contact with the object takes place that one responds to it, that one reacts to it in some way, that one forms intentions regarding that object. If I'm looking around and I don't see, say, I'm waiting for some friend to meet me at some place, I'm standing on the corner, I keep on looking down the street, I don't know which direction he's coming from, whether north, south, east, or west, so I keep on looking around. Until the contact takes place to perceive him, until the contact takes place, then I won't perceive him. And so I just stand there looking around. But when he comes walking down one of the streets, then through the eye, the consciousness makes contact with his form. Then there comes the perception of him. Then based on that perception, there comes some volitional response. Then I might walk towards him to meet him. So in this way, volition depends upon contact. The name and form is the cause and condition for the manifestation of the consciousness aggregate. Again, this is something I explained last week, but I'll just go over it very briefly again. That even though we speak about consciousness making contact with an object, as though consciousness can exist on its own, but actually consciousness always occurs bound up with name and form. So the consciousness is based on this physical body, so it's connected with form. And consciousness always arises together with what we call name or nama. What does name consist of? It consists of feeling, perception, volition, and attention and contact. And so in order for consciousness to exist, it has to be based on these five factors that make up name or nama. There's no consciousness without some coexisting feeling, coexisting perception, coexisting volition, coexisting attention, and all of those depend on contact. So consciousness is occurring in one mode based on name and form, then when a new contact occurs, that new contact will give rise to a new feeling, a new perception, new volition, new attention. Then still another contact takes place, and then that's followed by still another feeling, another perception, another volition, another attention. Okay, so when I look over the horizon, looking for my friend, at that time there's a consciousness making contact, and it's having perceptions, but I'm perceiving the street with other people that I don't know walking up and down, but I don't have the contact with the face or form of my friend. And so there's one kind of feeling occurring. Maybe this is a neutral feeling. There's a perception occurring, but it's perception of people that I don't know. The volition is just to stand there and keep on looking, not to move. But then the contact takes place with the form of my friend. Then maybe there comes a pleasant feeling, because now he's arrived. Then there's the perception going with that. The perception, that's my friend. Then there comes the volition, let me walk towards him. And so everything changes because of the new contact. Then maybe we're walking together down the street. Then I look up and I see a coffee shop. So new contact. And so maybe he says to me, would you like some coffee? And so I say, okay, let's go in. Okay, so there's new contact, so everything changes. New feeling. Again, it's a pleasant feeling if I want to drink coffee. If I don't want to drink it, then just a neutral feeling. If I don't like coffee, then maybe sometimes unpleasant feeling. Or if I've sworn to give up coffee because it keeps me up at night, then maybe there's an inner struggle. If I like coffee but I've sworn to give it up, conflict. Conflicted feeling. Okay, so then, actually in this case, first the perception, sign, first there's the contact with the sign, Starbucks, latte, what is it, South American latte, with fresh baked pie, apple pie. Okay, so contact, then here first the perception, identifying the meaning of the sign, then connecting that meaning with the idea of drinking coffee, then the feeling, the pleasant feeling, the volition, the desire to go into the shop. So all of this becomes new depending on the contact. Okay, so, and then all of these are changing, and so the consciousness is changing together with the changes in the contact, name and form and so on. So they're actually, name and form and consciousness are always locked together, interwoven, occurring together like two sides of the same coin. Okay, now the monk asks a very important question. He says, how does identity view come to be? This is one of the most important terms in the Buddha's teaching. In any translation, it's somewhat inadequate. Okay, so the word here that's translated as identity view, in Pali it's Sakkaya Ditthi. Okay, the word Ditthi means view. That's no problem, that's pretty straightforward. But the problem is this word Sakkaya. The word Sakkaya comes from, the main part of it is Kaya, which means body. And then it has a prefix Sat, which means existing. So literally, Sakkaya is existing body, or the substantial body. But it doesn't refer just to the physical body, but it refers to the entirety of the person, the living being. And specifically it means the living being or the person viewed as the combination of the five aggregates, or the compound of the five aggregates. And so this is a word that occurs frequently in the early suttas. And so it's the way the Buddhist texts view the living being. They view the living being as being a composite entity, an entity it's always, the components are always functioning together. One can't isolate feeling, perception, the volitions and consciousness and put them into little boxes and then say, take one out and say, this is a feeling separate from the rest of the other aggregates. That's why I think sometimes popular preachers illustrate the idea of the five aggregates by the simile of a car or a bicycle. So you can take a car apart and say, this is the carburetor, these are the pedals, this is the handle, this is the transmission, this is the exhaust pipe. And you still have the pedals, the the steering wheel, the carburetor, the transmission, and so on. Because with the car, we put them together and then you get a functioning car. But we can't separate, if you separate feeling, perception, volition, consciousness, you'll be left with just a dead body, not a living being. But when we look at the individual, the person, with this analytical eye, we can see that the person is a functioning unity with five different aspects. And so, from a particular perspective, we can look at these five aspects as distinct. But we shouldn't think that somehow you just take a body and put in a feeling, put together a perception, take some volitional formations, lock them, tie them in, and then wrap the whole thing up in consciousness, and then you get a living being. Okay, so Sakkaya is this functioning unity of the five aggregates. And then, regarding Sakkaya, one forms a particular view. And this is the view that, according to the Buddha's teaching, is at the root of all suffering and bondage. And that is the view of a truly existing self. So now the monk is asking, how does identity view come to be? In other words, how does one form a view of a truly existing self with regard to these five aggregates? And so the Buddha is going to explain Sakkaya Ditthi, the view of a self, in terms of the person who is called, the word used here is the uninstructed worldling. The Pali word is Putujana. The word putu means many, or common, or ordinary. And so Putujana is the ordinary person. And this means a person, the ordinary person or the common person, the person who is uninstructed, which means somebody who hasn't listened to, absorbed and digested the Dhamma, the teaching of the Buddha, who is not a seer of the noble ones, who doesn't have regard or respect for the noble persons, the ones who have reached true realization. and who is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma. Unskilled in the Dhamma means they haven't learned the Dhamma, and they're undisciplined in it, which means they haven't trained in the Dhamma. Who is not a seer of the superior persons, the saintly persons, and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma. Okay, so such a person, here we come to the view itself. Such a person regards form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. Similarly, he or she regards feeling as self, perception as self, the volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. So when we look at this passage, we can see that there are 20 forms, or 20 modes, that Sakkaya Ditthi, the identity view, can assume. We take any one of the 5 aggregates, okay, so taking X to represent any one of the 5 aggregates, so we have 4 ways in which that aggregate can be related to the idea of self. The first is simple identification. One thinks, I am the body, or the body is myself. That's with regard to form. Second, one conceives of the self as being something distinct from form, or whatever aggregate is being considered. Something distinct from it which possesses it. This is illustrated by the example of, for example, a farmer possesses the cow. So the cow is one thing, the farmer is another, but the farmer owns the cow. Of course, the cow might object and say, I own the farmer. Okay, the third way, again, there's a separation between self and the aggregate. The aggregate exists in the self. This would be the conception of some kind of vast, all-comprehending self. These were kind of views that were common during the Buddha's time. And then the particular aggregate, whether the body, feeling, and so on, exists enveloped in, embraced by that vast, infinite self. And then the fourth way of conceiving it is that the self is in X, within the aggregate. So one might think that the self is something very small, very minute, maybe like a soul existing within the heart of the body. Or one thinks of the feeling, the perception, the volitions, the consciousness as things which envelop and embrace the self. So the self is at the center within these 5 aggregates. Okay, so X represents any of the 5 aggregates, and so one can form any of these 20 forms of identity view. And probably there are ways to combine these 20 so you get a vast number of many more types of identity view. But these 20 are just the 20 basic types. Okay, so those that is identity view. And then the monk asks, how does identity view not come to be? And then the Buddha answers, and then the answer is given with regard to the instructed noble disciple, the Arya Savaka. In my understanding, this is my understanding, some people ask whether noble disciple here means one who has become a noble person. I think that is the kind of ideal of the noble disciple, the one who has actually become a noble one. But I think noble disciple has a broader meaning to include those who are not yet, maybe not yet reached stream entry, but they've heard the Dhamma, understood the Dhamma at least intellectually, and they're practicing in accordance with the correct path in order to overcome the wrong views and the different fetters. So the noble disciple is not necessarily a disciple who is a noble one, but it's a disciple who is of a noble quality of mind, or it could be even a disciple of the noble ones. But the noble disciple is described as instructed, one who has heard the Dhamma, understood the Dhamma, who is a seer of the noble ones, who has regard for the noble persons, and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma. Such a one does not regard form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. And so he does not regard feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, and so on. In other words, this passage is simply a negation of the previous one. So the disciple who correctly understands the Dhamma, even without actual penetration of the truth, this disciple doesn't hold to any of the types of identity view. Doesn't grasp any kind of view of a truly existing self. Maybe before going further, I'll pause and ask whether there's any questions at this point. But before you ask your questions, let me take the written question first. The written question says, does the consciousness cling to nama rupa, to name and form, as its object? Okay. Does the consciousness cling to name and form as its object, so that clinging is not only found in volitional formations? I think technically one would have to say that the clinging itself is found in the aggregate of volitional formations, but when the clinging is occurring in the volitional formations, then all of the other aggregates are in some way involved in that clinging. But the clinging itself belongs to the aggregate of volitional formations. That's my understanding. Okay, but I have to give priority to the people who actually come to the class. Somebody has a lot of questions, but...
In terms of the five aggregates and the different realms, you were saying that they appear in different combinations?
Yeah.
So let's say in the formless realm, you still have...
Oh, yeah, okay, this is a good question. Whether in the formless realm one still has form. Yeah, I didn't want to make all of the possible qualifications, but there is that important reservation that in the formless realm, the form aggregate drops away. And so, in the formless realms, one only has the four mental aggregates: consciousness, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. There's no body, no sensory form objects. Don't ask me to describe what it's like there.
And my other was on page 307, you had some similes with the aggregates. And under volitional formation, you have a banana tree trunk. I don't understand.
On 3, what?
307, page 307. You have the 5 aggregates, and then you have similes.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. That's already on this chart.
A banana tree trunk.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. The sutta from which those similes are taken is coming right up ahead. We'll get to that.
I cannot distinguish self as possesses X and X is self. Will you give the definition of self later? Because when X is in self, it seems to me self possesses X.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between X in self and self possesses X?
I think it's possible to combine those two views. I don't think the views are necessarily mutually exclusive. So one could have the view of the self in X or X within the self, and also at the same time the idea that this X, which is either one could have, combine these two views. Self possesses X, and the self is in X, or X is in the self. One could combine. You can't combine those two, the last two, but self possesses X, and X possesses self. I'm getting all mixed up here. Self possesses X, and self is in X, or self possesses X, and X is in self. You're shaking your head.
The Chinese text, the sutra here, actually says, instead of self possesses X, it says X is separate from self. So in the sense that you have something that is external to self, but anything external to self, I think from the Mahayana point of view, is something that can be possessed by self. And I think I asked you this question before. And therefore, in that case, you have something separate from self, but it's not in self or being the bigger part of self. So that actually is exactly 4 different modes.
Second and third are
I think because these don't make logical sense, that's why X is not self.
It's perfectly logical. The first one is X equals self.
Yeah.
The second one is X does not equal self, completely separate. The third one is X is a smaller circle, self is a bigger circle. The fourth one, self is a smaller circle, X is bigger. So 4 completely different modes. That's at least the Chinese text.
Possible, but I just know the Pali would have atanam, rupavantang atanam, which is possession. It doesn't necessarily posit complete separation. So I have to say, I'm not sure whether the two can be combined. But in any case, there's some difference in modality between being the self within the aggregate, or the aggregate being within the self. Those two are mutually exclusive, one could see. And whether possession can be combined with them or not, but at any rate, using that expression, self possesses X, it indicates a different modality or a different nature to that relationship. So I think that's why it's mentioned separately. Understood?
Bhante, will you give definition of self later?
Okay, let me try to do it now. Because what's interesting, the texts never really give, the suttas never really give a formal definition of self. They always seem to assume that one knows what self means. But there is a distinction made. You see the word atta, or its different forms, atano, atana, atanam. They're used in Pali in an ordinary sense to refer to oneself simply reflexively as a person, an individual, a living being, without any kind of metaphysical connotations. So that's the ordinary use of the word self in Pali, just like we use the word self in English. I did this myself. This is my own. You have to take responsibility for yourself. Okay, so that's the ordinary sense of the word self, which the Buddha doesn't reject, but he uses this as part of conventional discourse. But what he is sort of targeting through his teaching is the idea of some kind of, let's say, an entity, a substantially existent entity, which is the, let us say, it's I would define it as an enduring center or basis of personal identity. And so the idea of self develops out of the reflexive idea of I. This idea of I or I am arises because of ignorance. It arises based on the functioning of these five aggregates. And because of these five aggregates are intricately interwoven, and they're arising and passing with extreme rapidity. And so based on that distortion of perception, not being able to set one's personal identity into the five aggregates, not being able to perceive the arising and passing away of the five aggregates, we think, I am, I exist. And that idea arises naturally and spontaneously because of the ignorance. And that is what's called the conceit I am, asmimana. But then because this idea of I is occurring repeatedly, I did this, I felt that, I want this, I don't like that. I see, I hear, I smell, I taste, I think. Because the idea of I occurs like this, one concludes, or one becomes convinced that there is some kind of self, some kind of lasting basis, enduring basis for this idea of I. And this idea of an enduring basis or a solid core of personal identity, that is the idea of self.
I have another question. What's the difference between the manifestation of form and the arising of form? Because for the manifestation of form, it says it's four great elements. Yeah. But for the arising of form, it's nutriment. The nutriment has four types too. So what exactly is the meaning of manifestations.
Here I don't really understand, I don't take it that there's a substantial, a significant difference between manifestation and arising. And even though technically there are the 4 types of nutriment, but I think in regard to, when it said that nutriment is the cause for the arising of the body, I think it's referring there to the solid nutriment, to the edible nutriment, not to contact, volition, or consciousness. As I said earlier, the way I understand the difference between these 2 passages, the earlier one is referring to the form as the physical body, the organic body, since that depends on the nutriment. Whereas this later passage, the passage that we just went through, is referring to form in a very general sense, whether form of the body or external material form of inanimate objects. Of course, all this form is made up of the 4 aggregates. The 4 elements. That's the way I understand it.
Something, can I ask a textual question?
Yeah.
You use the word diversity, saying that can there be diversity in, say, the desire and lust for the 5 aggregates. What does diversity mean?
Here, diversity means differences. So there are differences in this desire and lust because the desire and lust in one case is relating to form, another case relating to feeling, another case relating to perception, and so on. So the desire and lust is different depending on which of the 5 aggregates it's related to.
I don't think the text answered that question, if there is any diversity. It only says, if it happens in the past, in the future, present, and so on and so forth. Does that mean there is diversity or there is no diversity?
You're referring to the passage at the top of page 339?
Well, yeah, starts from the bottom of page 338.
Yeah.
That is the question.
Yeah.
Then page 339 gives the answer. And I cannot tell from the answers whether there is diversity or there isn't diversity.
The answer is, because the first part of the answer is there can be, monk. And then this is the diversity that, or apparently this is the diversity with regard to each of the different 5 different aggregates. There's some difference in the way it occurs. As usual in the text, we don't have lengthy explanations because they have to keep it compact in order to preserve it for memorization. So often the detailed explanations we have to work out for ourselves, forcing us to think. Yeah, please.
I have a clinging to this question of consciousness, and I keep asking you too many times, but I would like to ask one more time. Maiden form is the cause and condition for the manifestation of consciousness active. Now, consciousness, maiden form is not only a condition, but it is the cause for the arising of consciousness. This one, to me, this really tells me that there's a difference of rebirth linking consciousness, and you mentioned from the Digha Nikaya, the consciousness coming from it just does not go together. So to me, what we call consciousness begins together or after the arising of nama rupa. Before that, there's a different life. It just always, this bothers me, this paragraph.
I'm not quite sure that I get the point.
Because if...
I mean, you're thinking the consciousness that is coming over into the rebirth process won't be associated with name and form, is that it?
Well, before the conception, there was no nama rupa, right? For the newborn.
Yeah.
So that means there is no consciousness at the moment until you have the conception. I mean the nama and rupa as a newborn life.
In order for conception to take place, or at least, let's say, in order for a new being to come into existence,
it's not in order to. It's the consciousness of new being begins with the new being, begins with the nama, the form, nama rupa of that new being, not before that. That's the
anyway, this gets to be a complicated issue. Will you stay for the discussion period?
Sure.
Let's deal with that question there. Otherwise, we have to. I really want to move on because I want to complete this. And now these complicated issues would maybe require a lot of discussion. Okay, let us go on. I really wanted to make sure that the parts that I've covered here are clear, not to go into a lot of tangential discussion. Okay, so now the monk raises another question, and this question takes us to one of the patterns that we have on the table. This is the gratification triad. So the monk asks, what is the gratification, the danger, and the escape in regard to the five aggregates? So then the Buddha says, the pleasure and joy that arise in dependence on form. This is the gratification of form. In other words, because of form, pleasure and joy arise. So one sees some beautiful object, hears beautiful sounds, experiences anything else, any other kind of physical object through the senses, and that might give pleasure and joy. This is sukha and piti, I think. So sukha somanassa. Okay, so what is the danger or the drawback or the unsatisfactoriness? Form is impermanent, bound up with suffering and subject to change. Okay, so if one is clinging to the form that one experiences because of pleasure and joy, not only the outer form but also the form of the body, one clings to the body because it is a source of pleasure and joy, then the form is impermanent, it's bound up with suffering, and it undergoes change. Beautiful woman clings to her beauty. She gets, when she's young, very beautiful. She gets a lot of pleasure and joy because people admire her. Men are attracted to her. People praise her. Okay, but she gets older. The facial features change. They're impermanent. The beauty starts to fade. Then she experiences illness, pain, accidents, so suffering. Okay, and then this is all, everything is subject to change. So this is the danger or the drawback or the unsatisfactoriness in form. Then what is the escape or the release from form? The removal and abandoning of desire and lust. One gives up the attachment and craving for the form, and then one is delivered from form, released from it. Similarly, with feeling. Feeling is itself pleasure and joy. In dependence on perception, we perceive things that are nice, beautiful, attractive, and then that gives pleasure and joy. In dependence on volitional formations, we engage in activities that bring pleasure and joy. So that is the gratification, the enjoyment. Then through the senses, we cognize through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And through that cognitive activity, we experience pleasure and joy. So this is the gratification, the enjoyment, and consciousness. So gratification or the enjoyment arise, but then what happens is we cling to these things that give us pleasure and joy. And we cling to the pleasure and joy. But these things are impermanent, bound up with suffering, subject to change. That is the drawback in them. And then the release from them is removal and abandonment of desire and attachment. It's not the removal and abandoning of the pleasure and joy. One could still experience pleasure and joy through the senses, through the higher mind, but without attachment to that, then one doesn't undergo misery and suffering. Okay, so this takes us through the gratification triad. Then the monk asks another question. How should one know and see so that in regard to this body with consciousness and regard to all external signs, all external objects, eye-making, mind-making, and the underlying tendency to conceit no longer occur within? Okay, this is a very deep question. How can we overcome this, forming this idea of I, and then ascribing this idea of I to this body with its consciousness? That means all of these five aggregates together, and to all external objects. Usually the external objects we take to be mine. So this is mind-making, thinking in terms of I and mine, I and mine. Then the underlying tendency to conceit. This is the deep tendency to think I am, and then based on that idea of I am, one compares oneself to others and thinks, I am better, I am equal, I am worse. So these are three different modes of false thinking here. Thinking in terms of I, or I am. Thinking in terms of mine, that is mine. And then forming this idea, these ideas of conceit. I am better, I am equal, I am worse. So then the Buddha teaches how to contemplate the five aggregates as being not self. Whatever, any kind of form whatsoever, whether past, future or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, one sees all form as it really is with correct wisdom thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Any kind of feeling whatsoever, any kind of perceptions whatsoever, any kind of volitional formations whatsoever, any kind of consciousness whatsoever, whether past, future, or present, and so on, one contemplates all consciousness as it really is with correct wisdom thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So contemplating this is not mine, this knocks out this tendency to mind-making. Thinking this I am not, this knocks out the I-making. Contemplating this is not myself, this also knocks out the I-making. And then when one knocks out the I-making, then one gives up the tendency to conceit. And so when one knows and sees thus, then in regard to this body with consciousness, and in regard to all external signs, all external objects, I-making, mind-making, and the underlying tendency to conceit no longer occur within. Okay, so a person who is completely liberated in mind, will that person still think I or mine?
In the ordinary sense.
Right, exactly, correct. They could still think and speak I and mine, but in the ordinary or conventional sense. So, an enlightened person, like myself, can still consider this nice Chinese cup to be mine. No, we're joking. No, but if, say, they're given this cup, so they'll still think, this is my cup, but there's no grasping or clinging based in this idea of mine. And they'll still use the expression I when speaking with others as a term of conversation, just conforming to the conventions of ordinary speech. But there's no clinging to this idea of I as being some kind of truly existing entity. And then they they don't go around actively comparing themselves with others, but they might recognize that I am superior to this one in terms of this quality, or this person is superior to me in terms of that quality. But this doesn't become a basis for conceit, for either thinking I am better, or combatively, I am just as good as you are, or dejectedly thinking I am worse than that one, than that person. Okay, any questions on what I've just covered now? Yeah.
Regarding the I-making, for the uninstructed wording, there are two ways of regarding self. Four ways. Exit, self, position, four ways. And then for the wise people, the Buddha gives the three. This is not mine. This is not myself.
Yeah.
So would you say the last one? This is not myself.
Yeah.
That covers the last two of X is in self and self is in X.
I think the one, this is not myself, I think it's intended to eliminate all the types, all the four modes of Sakkaya Ditthi. Okay, when it applies it to each of the five aggregates, this is not mine, this is not I. Okay, it seems that when you're saying, this is not myself, One is taking each of the aggregates and saying, this is not myself. So it seems to correspond literally to the first of the four modes of Sakkaya Ditthi. Correct? But it seems to me that it's intended, when one contemplates all of the five aggregates, this is not myself, the intention is that it knocks out all 20 types of personality view, or of identity view. That's my understanding. Okay, then there's one question here, maybe it's related to your question. How does the first fetter, this is Sakkaya Ditthi, identity view, differ from the fetter conceit, since identity view includes consciousness as self too? Actually, we come to this question later in the book, when we come to the chapter on the stages of realization, the planes of realization. This is dealt with. In the sutta that occurs on page 402, starting on 402, the Khenaka Sutta. So I won't answer that question now, since the question will be answered when we come to that sutta. I actually want to move on unless somebody has an urgent question. Okay, so we come now to the next sutta. This is called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the characteristic of non-self. And in the course of the Buddha's ministry, this was the second formal discourse that he gave. The first discourse that he gave is called Setting in Motion the Wheel of Dharma, Turning the Wheel of Dharma. In that sutta, the first sutta, the Buddha explained the Four Noble Truths. And after that sutta, his first five disciples all became Sotapannas, they all became stream enterers. So now the Buddha, a few days later, he taught the discourse on non-self for the purpose of eradicating all of their defilements and enabling them to achieve arhatship. It's interesting that if they became Sotapannas, then they would have eliminated Sakkaya Ditthi, all views of self. And so it seems, why should they have to listen to a discourse on non-self, since they had already eliminated the view of self? But maybe it's just continuing to get that idea reinforced by the Buddha, then gives an extra punch to the mind to wipe out the idea of I am, that subtle clinging to the conception of I. Okay, so let us go. The Buddha says, addressing the monks, he says, monks, form is non-self, for if form were self, this form would not lead to affliction, and it would be possible to determine form in this way. Let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. Okay, so if form were self, then it would always have to be in a pleasant or desirable condition. It could never become a cause for misery and suffering. And we would have such power over the form that we would be able to control it so that it conforms exactly to our will. What we want it to be, it would be. What we don't want it to be, it would not be. So we want my form to be handsome or beautiful. I just have to think. No need for me to use any kind of makeup or go to the beach to get a nice tan. But I just have to think Let my form be beautiful and I become beautiful. Let my form not be thus. I don't want the form to become old, decrepit, sickly. I don't want to fall ill. So I just have to think, let my form not be thus, and none of this would happen. I remain always young, always healthy, always alive. I never die. But because form is non-self, form leads to affliction. So the idea of self, this is an important component of the idea of self. Going back to Borway's question earlier, it implies the idea of control or mastery. If something is self or belongs to self, I should be able to exercise mastery over that thing, so that it would not lead to affliction and I can determine it exactly according to my will. But because form is non-self, form leads to affliction, and it is not possible to determine form. Let my form be thus. Let my form not be thus. Okay, then the same argument is presented in relation to each of the other aggregates. If feelings were myself, then I would never undergo affliction, I would never experience painful feelings, misery, dejection, sorrow. If feeling were myself, if perception were myself, I would never have to perceive things which are unpleasant and disagreeable. If volitions were myself, I would never will things that lead to my suffering or to any kind of misery for me in the future. If consciousness were myself, I would never know anything that was unpleasant or disagreeable. But because each of these things is not myself, then they lead to affliction, and I don't have this perfect control over them. So that I could simply determine, let my feelings, perceptions, volitions, consciousness be thus, let them not be thus. Now it's very important here to prevent misunderstanding. This argument here doesn't mean that we don't have any degree of volitional control over the five aggregates. Because I can control my body within the limits of conditionality. If I want to be healthy, I can make the determination to take several walks every day, to do exercise, to eat right. So you can't be going to McDonald's for 3 meals a day and then sitting back on the sofa flicking the remote control and watching the TV all evening and saying, what can I do? I have no control over the body. Then you get fat, then you get heart disease and maybe strokes, and then say, what can I do? I'm just following what the Buddha says, no control. And then if you're like getting lazy and you don't want to go meditate, and so you want to continue watching the TV, and the time for the meditation comes, you can't say, well, the Buddha says no control over volitional formations. And so let me just continue watching the TV. But this program is boring. Let me at least exercise the volitional control to press the remote and change the station so I can get something interesting. Okay, so this is the basic argument that what's rejected here is what I call mastery over the five aggregates, which means that we could control the five aggregates completely in accordance with our will. But if we use the process of conditionality, we could work on the conditions to change our five aggregates within limits. Of course, I can never avoid growing old, falling sick, or dying. But within these limits, I could so direct myself so that I keep in good health, so that I can feel pleasant feelings by training myself in ways that lead to wholesome, pleasant feelings. I can train my mind, master my mind, and eventually liberate my mind. Okay, so this is, actually within the sutta we find two arguments for non-self. The first is based on this lack of control, lack of mastery. The second argument is based on the three characteristics. And here we come to the second of these formulas that I have on the table: impermanent, suffering, non-self. So what do you think? Is form permanent or impermanent? It's impermanent. The form, not only does it grow old, fall sick and die, but even from moment to moment, it's arising and passing, arising and passing. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Here the word dukkha doesn't really mean suffering in the sense of feeling misery, but it's more the sense of being unsatisfactory. So what is impermanent, arising and passing away, is dukkha. It's unsatisfactory. Arises, breaks up, arises, breaks up. Always changing, always in a process of becoming. So when it's impermanent, dukkha, unsatisfactory, and subject to change, always changing, is it fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself? Then the answer is no. Okay, so in a conventional sense, we can say these five aggregates are mine, this is what I am. But in the deep philosophical sense, we cannot say this. Because for something to be a truly existing self, it has to be permanent, it has to be bound up with pleasure, with happiness, and it cannot be undergoing constant change. Whatever is impermanent, always changing, is unreliable, insecure. And so if we say, this is myself, then that thing we're identifying, this is myself, is arising, vanishing, arising and vanishing. So it means myself is constantly arising, constantly vanishing. But the self has to be something which is lasting, which is enduring, which is permanent. Okay, so the same position is developed with regard to all of the five aggregates. And so then the Buddha sums up and he says, therefore, any kind of form, whatever, whether past, present, or future, and so on, should be regarded with correct wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Any kind of feeling, whatever, volitional formations, consciousness, all of this should be regarded with correct wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Okay, seeing thus, the instructed, noble disciple becomes disenchanted with form. He no longer takes the form to be mine and I. He becomes disenchanted with feeling, with perception, with volitional formations, with consciousness. Becoming disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. That is, his attachment or craving fades away, disappears, vanishes. Then through dispassion, viraga, his mind is liberated. And when the mind is liberated, there comes the knowledge it is liberated. And he understands destroyed is birth, the cycle of rebirth is finished, the spiritual life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. Okay, so this is what the Blessed One, the Buddha, said. The monks were elated and they delighted in the Buddha's statement. And while this discourse was being spoken, the minds of the group of 5 monks were liberated from the taints by non-clinging. So this is how those 5 monks achieved arhatship. Okay, I want to go on because I want to finish the section on the 5 aggregates today. I'm going to skip over paragraph D. I think everything in paragraph D, all the meaning you can understand based on what I've explained so far. Then we come to section E. This is the lump of foam. I included this because it gives these interesting similes for the 5 aggregates. So the Buddha was living at, now it's called Ayodhya, on the bank of the river Ganges. And so as they were sitting by the river, the Buddha spoke to the monks and said, suppose that this river Ganges was carrying along a great lump of foam, and a man with good eyesight would then take up that ball of foam and would inspect it, ponder it, and carefully investigate it. As he does so, it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial, for there's no substance, no essence in a lump of foam. And so, whatever kind of form there is, past, future, or present, and so on, a monk inspects it, ponders it, and carefully investigates it. And as he does so, it appears to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in material form? So this body looks to us solid and substantial, but when even if we use science, we investigate the body, it's made up first of cells. We take the cells, we look into the cells, they're made up of molecules. The molecules are made up of atoms. The atoms are made up of subatomic particles, which are just little particles or bundles of energy. In most of them, most of each atom is just empty space. They say that the matter, the nucleus of the atom, would be like putting a football in the center of a football field. And the electrons might be like a few spectators sitting in the stands, and the rest of the atom is just like all of the empty space of the stadium. And so the body is just like that, or all matter is like that, even the solid matter of the table, solid metals, mostly empty space. Okay, so that's the simile for material form. Then for feeling, suppose that in the autumn it's raining and there's a pool of water and then big raindrops are falling. And as the raindrops hit the surface of the water, a bubble arises and bursts on the surface of the water. Then a man with good sight investigates it, and the water bubbles appear to him void, hollow, insubstantial. In the same way, the meditating monk investigates feelings, and he sees that a feeling arises, it just subsists for a moment, then it bursts and vanishes. And so, when one is doing the insight meditation, examining feeling, one sees that even in 1 second, feelings are arising and vanishing many times. They just come, burst, and vanish. And even the feelings that we seem to be persisting, that seem to be lasting, if we attend to them closely, we see that they're made up of a sequence of feelings, each one arising, passing, arising and passing. So that's the simile for a feeling. Then perception. Let's take a modern example. On a hot summer's day, you're driving along the road, and ahead on the road you see a pool, what looks like a pool of water. But when you get to the place where that pool of water should be, it's gone, no pool of water. Then you look further ahead on the road, and there's another pool of water. But when you get to that spot, the pool of water is gone. So what do you find? The pool of waters are just mirages. Hollow, substantial, empty. Okay, and so whatever perception there is, past, present, or future, and so on, we inspect it, examine it, and it appears to be void, hollow, insubstantial. Perceptions are just momentary events. They depend upon sense faculty, object, contact, whole combination of factors. There's no kind of substance in the perception. Okay, the fourth simile, suppose a man comes along who needs heartwood, solids of wood, maybe to make some article of furniture. He takes an axe and he goes into the forest. He sees the trunk of a large banana tree, a plantain tree. That's banana tree. And he cuts it down at the root. Have any of you seen the trunk of a banana tree? Maybe people who have grown up in North America have never seen it. But when you take the trunk of a banana tree, what it consists of are just coils within coils, within coils, within coils. There's no core or hotwood to the trunk of a banana tree. It's a little bit like maybe saying an onion. If you want to get the solid core of an onion, you start removing one layer after another layer after another layer, until finally you come to the last layer and you say, the core substance of the onion will be in that. You move the last layer of the onion, and there's nothing inside. Gone. Okay, so the trunk of the banana tree is the same. You keep on removing till all of the coils are gone, and no substance, no heartwood. And so the volitional formations are of the same nature. We look into our volitions, we take apart one intention, one volition after another volition after another volition, looking for that self within. Who is the controller, the master, the one who's giving the instructions, the directions? And there's nothing but only these momentary events of volition giving instructions and directions. But no inner self, the doer, the actor. And then the fifth is the aggregate of consciousness. And this is like a magician or a magician's apprentice. At a crossroads, he displays a magical illusion. The usual example given, he takes some straw, twigs, grass, makes a pile, then puts his kind of kerchief in front of it, handkerchief in front of it, recites the magical formula, lifts up the kerchief, and there is a rabbit or a dog. Where did it come from? Okay, but somebody with good sight is inspecting and examining that magical illusion. And he goes up to the rabbit or the dog, tries to touch it, and his hand goes right through it. It's just an illusion that the magician has created through... This is the Indian belief that the magicians have this ability by reciting the appropriate mantras to deceive people into perceiving things that are not there. Not like our Western magicians who just use tricks of perception. Okay, so but when you try to find that object, nothing is there. So this is like consciousness. Consciousness is always showing us a world through each of the 6 senses, a solid world with apparently somebody within that's knowing. But when one investigates the consciousness, one sees it's just an active awareness that arises and passes away. So nothing solid or substantial there. Okay, then the last paragraph is the same as what we've already had. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the section on the 5 aggregates. Any questions? Brief questions? Please. Wait, take the
I get a little bit confused as far as the Buddha being in the time of taking from the Indian culture, and then what was his distinctive, so like as far as the attributes, like the Indians believe more in the existing self that goes from one life to the other, and the Buddha saying that, so what was the distinguishing thing that he did apart from the Indian philosophy at that time?
Where did the Buddha differ from the other Indian teachers?
Particularly.
Well, generally the prevalent view, let's say that there were 2 prevalent views in India at the time. The most prevalent view was the view that there is some kind of permanent self. There were many different theories about the self, but all of the different theories accepted the idea that there's some kind of permanent self which goes on from life to life, which is immortal, unchanging. Some conceived of a universal self, some of an individual personal self, but they all had the idea of some kind of enduring permanent self. The other idea, not so popular, was basically a materialism, that the person truly exists only as the body, the mind is just a byproduct of the body. When the body dies, then everything comes to an end. So what the Buddha did was first, through the doctrine of non-self, he negated the views of all of the thinkers who proclaimed that there's some kind of self. And the Buddha said that the view of self is a fundamental delusion, which is a kind of manifestation of ignorance. So through that, the teaching of non-self, the Buddha rejected the dominant view of self, but through his doctrine or teaching of dependent origination, he showed that when there is conditions, when there are the right conditions, the process of rebirth continues. But it continues as a process, not because of some permanent entity, the self. Any further questions on anything covered in today's class? Okay, then we'll stop now. We'll go for lunch and then come back here about 12 o'clock, and then we can discuss any other questions that you might have. Classes for the future. I'm going to make up a schedule, but I didn't get to do it yet. But the next class will be July 11th, then after that July 18th, and then I think August 2nd. I'm not so sure about the next class after that, but definitely July 11th, July 18th, I'll have the class here. And we go on continuing with this chapter. And next time I'll try to cover both the sense bases and the section on the elements. Both sections I'll try to cover next time. Yes, John?
On Bonji, you sent an email a couple of weeks ago, I guess, and you showed also July 18th, 11th, 18th, and 25th.
I said the 25th, did I?
You mentioned August the 2nd, just now.
Did the email say the 25th?
Correct.
Okay, then we'll have it Those 3 Saturdays.
Okay.
11th, 18th, 23rd.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we share the merits with the deities, the Bhutas or fair spirits, the Nagas, the dragon spirits, wishing them to be well and happy, to protect the Buddha's teachings, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata Chubumata Deva Naga Mahiltika Punyantam Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chubumata Deva Naga Mahiltika Punyantam Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantam Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Mang Parang. You do this the short way. Etavatacham hei sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya pavagupadhaya vici hetato etantare satakayo papanna rupi arupi cha asanya sanino tukha pamuchantu pusantu nibu